The senior management of Hillgate Technologies was drowning in arrogance, too intoxicated by power to notice the woman watching from the shadows. They saw Lucy Edwards, their new CEO, only as a diversity hire to be mocked. It was their final mistake. Lucy wasn't there to celebrate. She was the silent executioner of a leadership team that never saw her coming. The story is just getting interesting. Subscribe to this channel if you don't support racism and corporate frauds. Lucy Edwards didn't arrive at the Hillgate Technologies holiday mixer in a limousine, and there was no personal assistant clearing a path through the lobby. She walked in through the main entrance just like the junior analysts and the IT floor staff, wearing a coat she'd bought 3 seasons ago and carrying a standard guest pass. Her plan was simple. She wanted to see the company she had just been hired to lead before they had a chance to put on a mask for her. In her 15 years of corporate restructuring, Lucy had learned that the moment a new CEO is announced, the truth disappears. Information gets filtered through 3 layers of management before it reaches the top, and by the time a report hits a desk, the sharp edges have been sanded off. She didn't want the polished version of Hillgate. She wanted to see how the gears turned when the mechanics thought the owner wasn't watching. The room was crowded, smelling of catering and heavy cologne. Lucy stood near the back, blending into the shadows cast by the AV equipment. She watched the body language of the people around the buffet. At Hillgate, the social divide was a canyon. She had been the CEO on paper for exactly 72 hours. The board had fast-tracked her appointment because the stock was sliding and internal turnover was at an all-time high. They told her the culture was traditional. Standing there, unnoticed and unbothered, Lucy realized traditional was just a polite word for a hierarchy built on exclusion. She saw a group of younger developers huddled together, speaking in low voices and looking over their shoulders every time a manager walked by. They weren't celebrating. They were enduring. On the other side of the room, the executive tier had formed a tight, impenetrable circle. They weren't mixing or thanking their teams. They were holding court. Lucy took a slow sip of water and adjusted her position. She knew that within the hour, the board chairman would stand on the stage and introduce her. The unfiltered window was closing fast. She needed to see if the rot she'd suspected during the interview process went all the way to the core, or if it was just a few bad actors at the top. She didn't have to wait long for an answer. As she moved toward the drink station, she crossed paths with the very people who were supposed to be her right-hand advisors. The way they looked right through her told her more than any quarterly audit ever could. The laughter from the center of the room was loud, the kind of forced, performative noise that signals who holds the power in a room. Foster Green, the sales director, was leaning against a high-top table, a drink in one hand and a smartphone in the other. He didn't look at Lucy as she approached the nearby water station, but he made sure she was the subject of his next remark. "I think the caterers missed a spot," Foster said, loud enough for the 4 men around him to hear. He jerked his chin in Lucy's direction without making eye contact. Either that or the diversity outreach program started early this year. Lockhart Miller, the senior VP, let out a sharp, dry chuckle. He adjusted his tie and looked Lucy up and down with a clinical coldness, as if he were inspecting a piece of equipment that had been delivered to the wrong warehouse. "She's a bit far from the service entrance, isn't she? Maybe she's here for the scholarship interview." Lucy didn't flinch. She kept her back to them, focusing on the slow trickle of water into her cup. She was measuring the depth of their arrogance. These were men who had been running Hillgate into the ground for 18 months. Yet they felt secure enough to mock a stranger in a room they supposedly managed. "Look at that coat," Foster continued, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial tone that still carried. "You'd think if they were going to send someone to transform our culture, they'd at least dress the part. I give it 3 months before she realizes she's out of her depth and heads back to whatever nonprofit she crawled out of." 3 months? "You're being generous, Foster," Lockhart replied. He finally turned fully toward Lucy, a smirk playing on his lips. "Hey, excuse me. If you're looking for the coat, check. It's back toward the lobby. We're actually in the middle of a private event for the leadership team." The group around them went quiet, waiting to see if Lucy would shuffle away in embarrassment. One of the younger associates looked down at his shoes, clearly uncomfortable, but no one spoke up. The silence was heavy, broken only by the ambient noise of the party further away. Lucy capped her water bottle and finally turned to face them. She didn't look angry. She looked like someone taking notes on a failing experiment. Foster didn't wait for her to speak. He tapped his watch and looked at Lockhart. Anyway, I've got 50 on the over-under that the new CEO doesn't even make it through the Q1 earnings call. If she even shows up tonight. Probably stuck in traffic trying to find the executive parking she isn't used to. They laughed again, a tight, exclusionary sound. Lucy memorized the exact cadence of Foster's voice and the specific tilt of Lockhart's head. She wasn't just a target of their jokes. She was the person who was about to decide if they had a future in the industry. She walked past them without saying a word, her footsteps steady and deliberate, leaving the inner circle to congratulate themselves on a joke that was about to cost them everything. Emery Parker didn't just join the conversation. She anchored it. As the head of human resources, she was the person responsible for the very conduct policies Foster and Lockhart were currently shredding. But instead of de-escalating the situation, she leaned in, her eyes scanning Lucy with a practiced, judgmental squint that she usually reserved for disciplinary hearings. "It's not just the clothes, Foster," Emery said, her voice carrying that sharp, administrative edge. "It's the resume. I saw the short list the board was looking at. They're so desperate for a PR win that they're willing to overlook the lack of a tier 1 pedigree. You can't run a firm like Hillgate on life experience and state school credentials. This isn't a community outreach project." Lockhart Miller smirked, swirling the ice in his glass. "Exactly. We're talking about high-frequency trading algorithms and complex infrastructure. You don't just manage that. You have to understand the DNA of it. If the board brings in a figurehead just to check a box, the clients will smell the insecurity within a week." Lucy remained a few feet away, seemingly preoccupied with a stack of napkins, but she caught every syllable. The betrayal was clinical. Emery Parker was the one person in the building who had access to Lucy's full file. The double masters, the turnaround record at 2 Fortune 500 competitors, and the fact that she had graduated top of her class at a university Emery clearly considered beneath the Hillgate standard. By feeding the executive's bias, Emery wasn't just being petty. She was actively sabotaging the new leadership before it even walked through the door. "I've already heard the whispers from the floor," Emery continued, lowering her voice slightly, but not enough to hide her intent. "The staff is confused. They see the LinkedIn update and they ask me, 'Emery, does she actually have the technical depth to lead us?' And what am I supposed to say? I can't lie and say she's one of us. She's a political appointment, plain and simple." Foster Green laughed, a short, ugly sound. "A political appointment who's currently standing by the water cooler looking like she's waiting for a bus. Look at her. She's completely invisible. If she can't even command respect in a room full of holiday tinsel, how is she going to command a boardroom in Tokyo?" Emery nodded, her expression shifting to one of mock pity. "That's the tragedy of it. The board thinks they're being progressive, but they're actually setting her up for a very public, very expensive failure. It's almost cruel, really, to give someone a title they haven't earned just to satisfy a metric." Lucy tightened her grip on her water bottle. The data was complete. She didn't just have a sales problem or a VP problem. She had a systemic failure at the HR level. The person hired to protect the culture was the one poisoning the well. Lucy checked the time. In 3 minutes, the invisible woman was going to become the only person in the room who mattered. She turned away from the group and began walking toward the stage, her pace unhurried, leaving the three of them to enjoy the last few seconds of their perceived superiority. The feedback from the speakers hummed through the room, cutting through the laughter and the clinking of glasses. Arthur Sterling, the board chairman, stood at the front of the hall, tapping the microphone twice. The room didn't fall silent immediately. It took a few seconds for the gravity of his presence to pull the attention away from the bar and the private huddles. Arthur was old school, a man who believed in optics and protocol, and his expression was uncharacteristically tight as he scanned the crowd. If I could have everyone's attention for a moment, Arthur began, his voice amplified and steady. We've had a difficult year at Hillgate. We've faced challenges that have tested our resilience and our market position. But tonight isn't just about looking back. It's about the pivot. In the middle of the room, Foster Green nudged Lockhart Miller, leaning in to whisper something that made Lockhart smirk. They were still riding the high of their own jokes, assuming the pivot Arthur was talking about would be a figurehead they could easily manage. They looked toward the stage with the bored entitlement of men who thought they were the ones really holding the microphone. As many of you know, Arthur continued, the board has spent the last 3 months searching for a leader who can not only manage our assets, but reclaim our culture. We didn't want a caretaker. We wanted a builder. Someone who understands that a company's value is dictated by its integrity as much as its output. Emery Parker straightened her blazer, glancing toward the door as if expecting a grand entrance from a stranger in a designer suit. She looked ready to put on her professional mask, the one she used to greet people she planned to undermine later. The air in the room shifted. The junior staff stopped whispering, and a genuine, nervous curiosity took hold. I am incredibly proud to introduce the person who will be leading us into the next decade, Arthur said, his eyes finally locking onto a figure moving toward him from the back of the room. She is a woman of unparalleled technical depth and strategic foresight. Please join me in welcoming our new CEO, Lucy Edwards. The applause started out of habit, a polite, corporate reflex, but it faltered almost instantly. The room didn't just go quiet, it went cold. Lucy stepped out from the shadows of the AV booth and walked toward the stage. She wasn't wearing a tuxedo or a high-end dress. She was in the same modest coat and carrying the same water bottle she had been holding while Foster and Lockhart mocked her credentials. The silence was physical. Foster Green's drink stopped halfway to his mouth. Lockhart Miller's face went a sickly shade of gray as he realized the woman he'd told to find the service entrance was now his superior. Emery Parker looked like she had been struck, her mouth slightly open as she watched the invisible guest take the stairs to the stage with a calm, terrifying precision. Lucy didn't smile as she reached Arthur. She didn't offer a polite wave. She took the microphone from the chairman's hand, turned to face the crowd, and looked directly into the eyes of the men in the center of the room. The future of Hillgate Technologies had arrived, and she had heard every word they said. Lucy didn't rush the walk to the stage. She moved with a steady, rhythmic pace that forced the crowd to part like a slow-moving tide. The room remained trapped in a vacuum of sound, the kind of silence that happens right after a car crash. Every eye was fixed on her, tracking the woman who, moments ago, had been a ghost in the corner. As she passed the midsection of the hall, she intentionally veered toward the high-top table where the executive circle stood. Foster Green was still frozen, his hand gripping his glass so hard his knuckles were white. The smirk he had worn for the last hour had vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of pure terror. He tried to set his drink down, but his hand shook, the ice rattling against the glass in the quiet room. Lockhart Miller was worse. He had instinctively taken a step back, trying to put distance between himself and the person he had just called a diversity hire. He looked around the room as if searching for an exit, but he was pinned by the stares of the junior staff who had witnessed his earlier performance. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had inverted. Lucy reached the group and stopped. She didn't say a word. She simply looked at them. Up close, the inner circle looked smaller, their expensive suits and loud posturing unable to hide the frantic calculations happening behind their eyes. Emery Parker, the HR head who had questioned Lucy's pedigree, was staring at the floor, her breathing shallow and fast. She knew exactly what her own file said about professional conduct, and she knew she had just violated every line of it. The junior analysts watched from the periphery, their faces a mix of shock and emerging vindication. They saw the fear in their boss's eyes, and for the first time in years, the atmosphere of Hillgate felt different. The tension wasn't coming from the top down anymore. It was radiating from the woman standing in the middle of the aisle. Lucy broke the stare and continued her walk. She didn't look back. She climbed the 3 steps to the stage, her boots sounding heavy and final against the floor. When she reached the top, she turned to the chairman, took the microphone with a firm grip, and stood center stage. The walk was over, the observation phase was done, and the silence in the room was now hers to break. Lucy didn't start with a thank you or a greeting. She adjusted the microphone stand once, the metallic screech echoing through the hall, and looked directly at the center table. The room was so quiet that the hum of the ventilation system sounded like a roar. "I think the caterers missed a spot," Lucy said. Her voice was flat, devoid of anger, which made the words cut even deeper. Either that, or the diversity outreach program started early this year. A collective gasp rippled through the back of the room. Foster Green's face went from pale to a deep, bruised purple. He looked like he wanted to vanish into the floorboards. Lucy didn't give him the chance. She shifted her gaze slightly to the left. "She's a bit far from the service entrance, isn't she?" Lucy continued, her tone clinical. "Maybe she's here for the scholarship interview." Lockhart Miller flinched as if he'd been struck. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The junior staff members were now looking back and forth between the stage and the executive table, the realization of what had been happening in the shadows finally hitting them. Lucy leaned closer to the mic. Then there was the concern about the resume. The idea that a Tier 1 pedigree is the only thing that keeps Hillgate Technologies from collapsing. The suggestion that a political appointment couldn't possibly understand the DNA of high-frequency trading. She turned her eyes toward Emery Parker. The HR head was trembling, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Emery, you wondered aloud how I would command a boardroom in Tokyo if I couldn't command respect in a room full of holiday tinsel," Lucy said. "And Foster, you had a $50 bet on whether I'd survive the Q1 earnings call." Lucy paused, letting the weight of the repeated insults settle over the room. It wasn't a speech, it was a mirror. She was showing the entire company the exact rot she had discovered within 15 minutes of walking through the door. "I didn't come here to drink punch or talk about the weather," Lucy said, her voice dropping an octave. "I came here to see the unfiltered version of Hillgate. And thanks to Foster Green, Lockhart Miller, and Emery Parker, I saw exactly what I needed to see. I saw a leadership team that views its employees with contempt and its new CEO as a metric to be managed rather than a leader to be followed." The silence that followed was heavy, expectant, and final. Lucy wasn't looking for an apology, and the three executives were too shattered to offer one. She reached into her coat pocket, the same coat they had mocked, and pulled out a small, folded document. The playback was over. The sentencing was about to begin. Lucy didn't wait for them to mount a defense. She knew that in a corporate environment like Hillgate, the only thing more dangerous than a toxic executive was a toxic executive given time to pivot. She looked down at the paper in her hand, then back at the three people standing in the center of the room. At Hillgate Technologies, every executive contract includes a standard clause 9.2, Lucy said, her voice cutting through the heavy air. It's a zero-tolerance ethics provision. It states that any conduct that creates a hostile work environment or demonstrates a fundamental lack of professional integrity is grounds for immediate termination for cause, without a severance package. Foster Green finally found his voice, though it sounded thin and desperate. "Lucy, Miss Edwards, that was just locker room talk. It was a misunderstanding. We didn't know who you were." "That is exactly the problem, Foster," Lucy replied. "Your respect shouldn't be reserved for people who have the power to fire you. It should be the baseline for everyone who walks through these doors. The fact that you only regret your words because you realized I signed your checks proves you are unfit to lead this staff." She turned her gaze to Lockhart Miller, who was trying to catch the chairman's eye, looking for a lifeline that wasn't coming. "Lockhart, you question the DNA of my leadership. I've spent the last 20 minutes observing yours. It's built on exclusion and a misplaced sense of superiority that has clearly stifled the innovation in this room." Then she looked at Emery Parker. The HR head was shaking, her eyes darting toward the exits. "And Emery, as the head of human resources, your job was to be the firewall against this exact behavior. Instead, you were the fuel. That is the highest form of professional betrayal." Lucy didn't look at the chairman for permission. She had already cleared this with the board's emergency committee 10 minutes before walking onto the stage. Foster Green, Lockhart Miller, and Emery Parker. Your employment with Hillgate Technologies is terminated, effective immediately. Your access to company servers was deactivated 60 seconds ago. Security will meet you at the elevators to escort you from the building. You are not to return to your desks. Your personal belongings will be couriered to your homes tomorrow. The room remained in a state of shock. In most companies, a firing of this magnitude happened behind closed doors, hidden by NDAs and quiet resignations. By doing it here, in front of the entire workforce, Lucy wasn't just clearing out the top floor. She was performing a public exorcism of the culture they had created. Foster began to protest again, stepping forward as if to argue. But two security guards, who had been briefed by the chairman's team during the intro, quietly moved in from the side of the room. They didn't use force, but their presence was final. The three executives were led toward the back of the hall, passing through a gauntlet of employees who, for the first time in years, weren't looking at them with fear. Lucy watched them go until the double doors at the back of the hall clicked shut. The silence that followed wasn't cold anymore. It was expectant. The weight of the old Hillgate had left the room, and the air felt, for the first time that night, like it was actually worth breathing. Lucy waited for the sound of the double doors to fade before she turned her full attention back to the room. The air was thick with a mix of shock and a strange, cautious relief. She could see it in the faces of the junior developers and the mid-level managers standing near the back. They were looking at each other, trying to process the fact that the three most powerful people in their daily lives had just been erased from the company roster in under 5 minutes. "I know what the atmosphere at Hillgate has been like," Lucy said, her voice projecting clearly without the need for theatricality. "I've spent the last hour listening to the people who were supposed to lead you. And I've spent the last 3 days reviewing the exit interviews of the talent we've lost. The common thread wasn't a lack of skill or a lack of market opportunity. It was a lack of basic human respect." She stepped to the very edge of the stage, closing the physical gap between herself and the staff. "The era of the elitist boys club at this company is over. Effective tonight, the culture of who you know and where you went to school is being replaced by a culture of what you contribute. We are a technology firm, not a country club. If you are here to work, to innovate, and to treat your colleagues with dignity, you have a home here. If you were part of the inner circle that thrived on the toxicity I just removed, I suggest you spend the weekend updating your resumes." A murmur went through the crowd, but it wasn't one of fear. It was the sound of 1,000 suppressed conversations finally finding an outlet. Lucy saw a young woman in the third row, the same one who had flinched during Foster's earlier outburst, slowly straighten her shoulders. "Starting Monday, we are implementing a flat reporting structure for all internal projects," Lucy continued. "We're opening up a direct line for ethics and cultural concerns that bypasses traditional HR channels until we can rebuild that department from the ground up. I don't want your silence. I want your input. Hillgate belongs to the people who do the work, not the people who spend their afternoons betting on the failure of their peers." She didn't ask for a round of applause, and she didn't wait for a standing ovation. She didn't need the validation of a crowd that was still half convinced this might be a dream. "Enjoy the rest of the evening," she said, her tone softening just enough to be human but remaining firm. "Get some rest. We have a significant amount of work to do, and for the first time in a long time, that work is actually going to matter." As she handed the microphone back to the stunned chairman, Lucy watched the room transform. The tight, defensive clusters of people began to break apart. People were actually talking to one another, not in whispers, but with the volume of people who no longer felt they had to hide. She had done more than just fire 3 executives. She had given the rest of the building permission to breathe. The pivot wasn't just a strategy on a slide deck anymore. It was the reality of the room. The 7 a.m. air inside the Hillgate headquarters was usually stagnant, filtered through a ventilation system that felt as tired as the workforce. But on Monday morning, when Lucy swiped her badge at the turnstile, the atmosphere had a different weight. The security guard, a man named Marcus who had worked the front desk for 6 years, didn't just give the customary, hollow nod. He stood up, looked her in the eye, and said, "Good morning, Ms. Edwards." It was the first time in his tenure he'd felt compelled to use a CEO's name. Lucy walked through the open-plan office toward the elevators. Usually, at this hour, the floor was a graveyard of empty desks, with the staff rolling in at the last possible second to avoid the toxic energy of the executive suite. Today, the lights were already humming. In the engineering bay, 3 developers were huddled over a monitor, coffee mugs in hand, actually debating a lines of code solution without whispering or looking over their shoulders for Foster Green's disapproval. When she reached the top floor, the silence was different. The heavy, pressurized tension that usually hung around the glass offices of the VPs had evaporated. The doors to the executive suite were open. Lucy didn't go into her own office. Instead, she walked to the communal break room where a junior data analyst was refilling the bean hopper in the coffee machine. The young man froze for a second, then realized she wasn't there to bark an order. "I'm Lucy," she said, extending a hand. "I know," he replied, shaking it firmly. "I'm Leo. We saw what happened Friday night. I think most of us stayed up late talking about it." "Good," Lucy said. "I hope the conversation was about what we're building next, because the old blueprints are in the shredder." By 8:30 a.m., the engine of the company, the people who actually wrote the code, managed the servers, and talked to the clients, was fully engaged. There was no frantic scrambling to hide mistakes, and no one was spending their morning crafting defensive emails to protect their jobs from Lockhart Miller's ego. Lucy spent the next 4 hours walking the floor. She didn't hold a town hall. She had 20 individual conversations. She asked about the bottlenecks, the stalled projects, and the talent that had been ignored because they didn't belong to the right social circles. She saw the exact moment the shift became permanent. It was when a mid-level manager realization hit. The person in the corner office wasn't a myth or a predator. She was a mechanic. She was there to fix the machine, not just own it. The 3 empty offices of Green, Miller, and Parker remained dark, their nameplates already removed. They served as a quiet, structural reminder that the hierarchy of Hillgate Technologies had been leveled. As Lucy finally sat down at her desk to look at the Q1 projections, she didn't feel like an outsider anymore. She looked out at the bustling floor through the glass and saw a company that was finally starting to reflect the integrity she demanded. The diversity hire had done more than fill a seat. She had reclaimed the soul of the business. The work ahead was massive, but for the first time in the history of Hillgate, everyone was pulling in the same direction. Lucy Edwards didn't just change the leadership at Hillgate Technologies. She changed the frequency of the entire company. Her story is a stark reminder that true power doesn't come from a title or a tier, one pedigree. It comes from the respect you show to the people who keep the gears turning. When you treat your workforce like a metric and your peers with contempt, you aren't just failing as a leader, you're betting against your own survival. What would you have done in Lucy's shoes? Was a public termination the right move to reset the culture, or was it too extreme? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you believe that integrity and merit should always outweigh the old boys club and corporate ego, then you're in the right place. We bring you the most intense, real-world stories of boardroom justice and high-stakes leadership every single week. Do not let the algorithm hide our next move. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and join a community that values the truth over the mask. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your standards higher. This is where the real power plays happen.